Part of review here. What we're going to do is look at the United States in the second part of the Cold War and how it continued to fight against the Soviet Union throughout the late 1900s in pursuit of dominance of ideology around the world. Now, John F. Kennedy, who was president beginning in the early 1960s, Kennedy continues the ideas of Harry Truman, where, like the Truman Doctrine, he says that his job as president, our role as the United States, is to contain and extinguish the blaze of communism. Now, just like we saw in our first video, looking at the Soviet Union and the U.S.'s battle for influence, Marshall Plan, Truman Doctrine, the U.S. found new ways to intervene in other countries, especially around the Third World, places like Africa and Asia. And the Third World was a big target by the United States because these countries were emerging as independent nations for the first time. They were colonized during the era of colonialization, and they were starting to become more and more independent. And this was because, again, Europe, after World War II, wasn't able to continue to manage these empires with all their struggles after being bombed out after the war. So the US and Soviet Union are going to try to take these countries and make them either democratic or communist. And the main way in which the United States does this is through covert action by the CIA. The CIA, or the Central Intelligence Agency, is our main way in which we try to influence other countries around the world. And the man that was in charge of the CIA at this point was Allen Dulles, who was responsible for the US's activities around the world. Now, he used many different tactics, but one, for example, in Guatemala, was backing a military coup to remove the president at that point, Jacobo Arbenz. In Iran, we see the prime minister, Mossadegh, was overthrown because he wanted to give control of oil back to the Iranians rather than allowing Western companies to get involved. In the Congo, we see Patrice Lumumba was assassinated. In Chile, we see Allende is removed from the presidency and a dictator, Pinochet, is put into power. And then, of course, in Cuba, we have the Bay of Pigs invasion, which tried to lead to the overthrow of Fidel Castro. The U.S. tried to assassinate Castro many other times beyond that. But no country was more intervened upon by the United States than Vietnam, which was led by Ho Chi Minh, who was a North Vietnamese communist who wanted to help return power and resources to the Vietnamese rather than the West. Now, many Western countries like France, who colonized Vietnam at one point, wanted their resources like rice, coal, rare materials, and rubber later on for cars. Now, the fear was that if Ho Chi Minh became the power in the country, that they would become communist. So France and the United States go to war with Vietnam, and the U.S. paid for 80% of the costs, over $10 billion. Meanwhile, Mao Zedong in China was helping North Vietnam to try to defeat the French. Now, this war ends in an armistice, and ultimately what happened was, just like Korea, Vietnam is divided at the middle point. This tried to make it so that they would reunite in a couple of years with an election. The problem is, many people down here in the South, which was backed by the U.S., support Ho Chi Minh. So the U.S. has a real problem on its hands, which the CIA discovered through a study it published in 1956. The United States, therefore, held an attempt at propagandizing the Vietnamese into going along with the United States. And in turn, what we would see is anti-Ho Chi Minh policies and propaganda was put up constantly. President Diem was the southern president of Vietnam, who the U.S. supported with financial support. But ultimately, he became untrustworthy because he was corrupt. He allowed his family members to work in government rather than hiring people that were really qualified for the positions. He discriminated against Buddhists, and ultimately, Buddhists made up a big portion of the Vietnamese population, which led to protests like this man self-immolating. Now, President Diem was assassinated, and the U.S. had hoped that they could replace him with somebody better. The problem is that 2 weeks later, JFK was assassinated, our president, and this led to the United States to ask a big question. Can Vietnam go on without the U.S. intervening, or ultimately would the U.S. have to put boots on the ground? Now, JFK never wanted to send troops to Vietnam, but ultimately President Johnson, who takes over for JFK, does begin to put boots on the ground. And this takes place after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where the United States claimed that the North Vietnamese struck them 2 times. Now, here's the thing. The second attack may not have actually happened, but this did allow the U.S. to escalate going to war. And this led to a full-scale war in Vietnam, another proxy war. Now, war in the jungle made conditions very different for the United States. The Vietnamese used guerrilla warfare, which allowed for them to basically employ ordinary villagers and fighters into the warfare. We would see that young children, maybe even, involved in combat. The Viet Cong were a guerrilla force that blended into the local population, and this made it difficult for the United States to fight them. We also saw that the Vietnamese had mastery over the landscape, the jungle, and caves, which ultimately they used to plant traps. They used many tactics against the Vietnamese. The U.S. utilized bombing campaigns, using napalm, using Agent Orange to try to expose the vegetation, or get rid of the vegetation, I should say. The United States measured its success with a crossover point, trying to kill as many Vietnamese as possible to stop them from being able to reinforce their troops. And this ultimately measured the U.S., or should I say, it led to the U.S. measuring success in body count. And finally, Ho Chi Minh Trail was a supply line that went from the north to the south. The U.S. would try to bomb it, but ultimately the Vietnamese were able to rebuild it, making it so that these U.S. tactics were not very good whatsoever. Now, the U.S. had to draft a whole lot of people into the war. While 2.7 million people served, over 650,000 of those were drafted, and 25% of those who fought in the war were draftees, showing that a huge part of the force ended up going without a choice. Now, 27 million people were eligible for the draft, but many people were able to get out of it, especially more wealthy people in society. Maybe 100,000 people fled to Canada, and estimates say that over 500,000 people committed draft violations so as not have to go to war. Now, the draft often gave people a variety of ways out of things, including deferments, like I have a medical issue, or I have a job, or I have children. But for the most part, working class people and minorities were not able to get deferments and would have to serve. Famous figures like Muhammad Ali, Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, and Joe Biden used various means to avoid the draft, with their choices later on shaping the way people thought about them as Americans. Some seeing them as heroes, others seeing them as draft dodgers. Now, the war in Vietnam had many controversies, largely stemming from the draft. There were many young people that opposed the war, one of them being Muhammad Ali, the greatest boxer in American history. Now, Muhammad Ali worked with folks like MLK Jr. to basically try to shut down the draft and prevent people from going to war against their will. And while Ali was stripped of his titles for the time and sent to jail, he was able to win an appeal, and he didn't serve any jail time. But there were many other young people that opposed the draft, not so much with their actions, like avoiding the draft, but with their words. For example, the Students for a Democratic Society drafted the Port Huron Statement, where they issued major criticisms of the ways society worked in the 1950s and 1960s. We saw many hippies, left-wingers, and even people at Woodstock playing music which opposed the war. Excuse me. We also saw that there were many protests at universities, and at one in particular, things got violent. At Kent State University in Ohio, 4 young people were shot and killed, which led to divisions around the country. Some people saw them as unpatriotic bums, whereas other people saw them as victims who were caught up in something that shouldn't have happened in the first place because this war was unnecessary. Now, during this time period, Secretary of Defense Bob McNamara was somebody that, sorry, I'll let the bell ring. He played a big role in facilitating the war in Vietnam, and he actually conducted a secret study to determine how the war was playing out. The secret study became known as the Pentagon Papers, which Daniel Ellsberg smuggled out of the Pentagon because it revealed so many of the issues and credibility with the government. The government was covering up their reporting on the war, or should I say the government was covering up the truth about the war to the public. whereas in secret it revealed that this war was unwinnable. And when the Pentagon Papers were leaked, it caused mass dissent for the war in Vietnam, and a lot of people began criticizing the government efforts after New York Times versus the United States. This was a major victory for this idea of freedom of the press, which we find in the First Amendment, and has a major legacy going forward in protecting the rights of the press. Now, as we closed out the war, Richard Nixon took over, and he wanted to do Vietnamization, which he wanted to give the war back to the Vietnamese. And ultimately, he got us out of the war in 1973. But unfortunately, the war in Vietnam was unsuccessful for the United States, leading to Vietnam unifying as a communist nation, and communism was spread to Laos and Cambodia, representing this domino theory playing out live and in form. This led to the passage of two big laws, the War Powers Act, which made the government needed an official declaration of war, and finally the 26th Amendment, which also lowered the voting age to 18. Because of all the anti-war draft protests, the government recognized the fact that they needed to actually support the people. Now, what we're going to look at to conclude things is the rise of conservatism. And during this time period, we're going to see the formation of the modern Republican government. Now, conservatives tend to favor a weaker government, a government that promotes liberty and a free market, and they rely on more traditional values to shape their sense of morality. We saw conservatism during the Roaring '20s with laissez-faire economics, such as Herbert Hoover saying that America needs to rely on its own, not rely on the government. We don't need the government to hold our hand. All right. So Barry Goldwater was the first big conservative to sort of make a splash. He criticized the civil rights movement and ultimately criticized the expansion of the government through the LBJ government, which attracted many Southerners, leading to Goldwater's victories in the Southern government. Now, Johnson would go on to win the election of 1964, but in 1968, a candidate by the name of Richard Nixon came on the scene, and he spoke out against all the craziness of the 1960s, the protests, the Black Panthers, the people that were arming themselves in the streets. He wanted to calm down the country. He wanted law and order. And Richard Nixon won a huge amount of votes in 1972. But Richard Nixon got caught cheating in the 1972 presidential election after it had ended. During the Watergate scandal, people working for Nixon had snuck into the Democratic Party's headquarters, where they ultimately tried to steal information from the Democratic Party. Richard Nixon tried to cover up this affair, leading to his inevitable impeachment, leading to his resignation.
Who will be the president?
Now, a couple years later, Ronald Reagan would become really the ultimate conservative president, where he, like many other conservatives after him, relied on very traditional values, which really stand the test of time today. For example, we compared Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump in the fact that they appeal to conservative social values like anti-abortion and affirmative action. They call for major tax cuts like Reaganomics and deregulation, and they both called to make America great again. Now, the very last thing that we looked at this year was the end of the Cold War and the September 11th attacks. During the Cold War, the main goal was to stop the spread of communism. And ultimately, the United States is going to win the Cold War. Now, in 1973, Richard Nixon, after Vietnam, wanted to calm things down. He passed an agreement called the SALT I agreements, which limited the amount of nukes that the United States and Russia would be able to create. The problem was that the Cold War would heat back up in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Reagan rejected the détente policy and began spending massively on the military, trying to reopen the competition, like the arms race, against the Soviet Union. And so Reagan is going to begin funding groups in Afghanistan called the Mujahideen. From there, what we're going to see is that money, over the course of the 80s, the money would increase by millions and millions. And as a result, the United States would also help to try to fund its military further at home in case the war were to ramp back up with the Soviet Union. Now, we used some of our technology during the space race to create the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was a planned military project by the Reagan administration to create an anti-nuclear defense system in outer space that would shoot lasers and help dismantle nukes in space. Really crazy stuff. Now, the Soviet Union tries to keep up with the US, but they can't. The Soviet Union's economy begins to falter and slip, and this gives the United States an opportunity to close the door on the Cold War. By bankrupting the Soviet Union, by forcing them to spend so much on their military, the United States is able to stop the Soviet Union from continuing their war in Afghanistan. The Berlin Wall would fall in 1989, which was the symbolic end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union opened their doors to capitalism in 1990, and in 1991, the Soviet Union officially fell. However, in 1990, as the Soviet Union was dismantling, the US turned its attention to a new force. In the Middle East, a gentleman by the name of Saddam Hussein was invading an area called Kuwait, who provided the US with lots of oil. The Kuwaitis were under attack by Iraq, who were struggling economically, and the US intervenes in what was called Operation Desert Storm, where they fight back against Saddam. However, during the late 1990s, we would see the rise of another threat, in addition to Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, who had seen the United States as an imperialist force who was trying to desecrate the Muslim faith in the Middle East. Osama bin Laden founded and funded the group Al-Qaeda in order to help fight back against the United States and other Western powers in the Middle East. Now, the U.S. at one point was funding the Mujahideen, who were organized by bin Laden. However, ultimately, the Al-Qaeda organization would lead attacks on America in the World Trade Center, both in 1993 by conducting a bombing, which failed to destroy the building, but then in 2001, which destroyed both Twin Towers in one of the most, harrowing days in U.S. history. And so what we looked at with 9/11 were some major impacts. One was the Patriot Act, which gave the federal government massive surveillance authority to try to spy on terrorists. What we came to realize was that the federal government was going way too far and collecting far too much information. We're also going to see that Islamophobia was majorly on the rise after 9/11, with hate crimes spiking against Muslims throughout the United States. And we would also see in a lot of pop culture, Islam being portrayed in a very negative light. And then finally, the United States not only invades Afghanistan in search of Al-Qaeda, but also Iraq in search of weapons of mass destruction, which, according to a chemical engineer, told the United States that yes, the Iraqis do have weapons of mass destruction. However, the weapons of mass destruction were never found, and so it was revealed that the weapons of mass destruction were ultimately likely a fabricated story to justify the invasion of Iraq. And that's the end of U.S. history. As far as our content go, guys, good luck on your studying. Wishing you all the best.